The moment our pickaxes shattered through that concealed chamber wall, releasing air that hadn't stirred in centuries, I knew we had disturbed something that should have remained buried. The crew foreman's face went pale as milk when he saw those peculiar markings etched into the stone, and by nightfall, something beneath the ridge began scratching at the floorboards of our bunkhouse with a patience that felt almost human. What happened in those Nevada hills during the winter of 1906 defies rational explanation, yet I swear upon my life that every word I write here is true. So, before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks! The taste of coal dust never left my mouth that entire winter. No amount of water could wash away the gritty film that coated my tongue and throat. I had traveled from Salt Lake City in the autumn of 1906, chasing rumors of steady employment after the copper operations had laid off hundreds of men. The promise was simple: Nevada coal, thick seams, easy extraction, good wages through the harsh winter months. The camp itself was barely worthy of a name. A collection of weathered canvas tents and warped timber structures clustered around a narrow-gauge railway spur that led nowhere important. The miners called it Blackwater Ridge Camp, though I never discovered whether that name came from the dark stone of the hillside or something else entirely. My quarters consisted of a creaking bunk in a drafty structure where my feet protruded into the frigid night air, and the wind rattled the walls with such violence that sleep came in brief, uncomfortable intervals. The company manager, a portly gentleman named William Briggs, wore an expensive pocket watch on a heavy chain and spoke in grandiose terms about fortunes to be made. He assured us we would all be wealthy within 12 months and departed within 24. I noticed he never descended into the shafts himself, preferring to remain above ground with his ledgers and projections. My crew numbered 6 souls. The bunk beside mine belonged to Patrick Connolly, a lanky Irishman whose beard grew in uneven patches, leaving bare spots on his cheeks that made him look perpetually boyish despite his 30-odd years. He possessed a crude sense of humor and hummed Irish folk songs whilst working, though I never learnt the names of the melodies. Adjacent to Connolly slept Miguel Alvarez, a Mexican laborer who had previously worked the silver mines in Virginia City. From the first day, Alvarez complained that the coal smelled wrong, too acrid, too dry, with an underlying mineral scent he could not identify. The other men dismissed his concerns, but I noticed he kept touching the small wooden cross he wore around his neck, his lips moving in silent prayer whenever we entered the mine. The youngest member of our crew was a slip of a lad we called Sparrow. He could not have been more than 15 years old, though he swore he was 18 to secure the position. His hands moved with remarkable speed, and his eyes held a desperate eagerness to prove himself worthy of a man's wages. I often caught him practicing a deeper voice when he thought no one was listening. The final 2 were brothers from Kansas, Eli and Thomas Ward. Broad-shouldered and taciturn, they communicated more through glances than words. They smoked cheap tobacco that smelled of burnt grass and kept their own counsel, rarely socializing with the rest of us outside of working hours. Our daily routine established itself quickly. We rose before dawn in the bitter cold, our breath forming clouds in the darkness. Breakfast consisted of beans and dense bread in the cookhouse, where a surly cook ladled portions with mechanical efficiency. Then we trudged up the narrow track to the mine entrance, a black opening carved into the hillside, framed by rough timber supports and surrounded by piles of excavated rock and soil. The darkness inside the hill possessed a quality I had never experienced in other mines. Our oil lamps seemed to produce light that traveled only a few feet before being swallowed completely, as though the shadows themselves were solid. The air felt thick and still, pressing against our chests with each breath. Those initial weeks passed in the familiar rhythm of mining work. We cut coal, loaded it into small carts, and pushed those carts back to the surface where mule teams hauled them to the processing structure. There were the usual complaints: roof collapses in minor sections, heated arguments between exhausted men, equipment failures, but nothing extraordinary. The local Shoshone families maintained their distance. When they came to trade goods at the camp, I observed them watching the ridge with expressions I could not quite decipher. Unease? Disapproval? Warning? Their interpreter, an elderly man who spoke both English and Shoshone, visited the camp occasionally, but never stayed long. I learned later that the indigenous people had stories about those hills, passed down through generations around their winter fires. Stories we should have heeded. Alvarez was the first to voice his suspicions aloud. One evening, as a particularly vicious wind drove most of the crew into the bunkhouse for shelter, he sat on the edge of his bunk, removing his boots. His English was heavily accented, but clear enough. "The coal, it does not sit correctly in the hill," he announced to no one in particular. "There are hollow spaces behind the seam, empty chambers that change the sound when you strike with the pick." Connolly laughed and asked what could possibly have created such voids. Alvarez merely shrugged and stared at the floorboards, his expression troubled. Sparrow listened with the intense focus of youth, clearly wanting to be included in the conversation of grown men. 2 days later, my pickaxe broke through into emptiness. We had progressed approximately 100 yards into the hillside, following the coal seam as it descended at a gentle angle. The atmosphere had grown oppressively warm and humid, unusual for a coal mine. Sweat soaked through my shirt and stuck the fabric to my back. Each swing of the pick required conscious effort in that stifling air. I distinctly remember the sound changing, the solid thunk of metal striking coal becoming a hollow crack. Then my pick punched through the seam entirely, and cold air rushed over my hands. Not the warm, stale air I expected, but a frigid draft that smelled of ancient stone and something else, something vaguely organic that I could not identify. We all froze. For several heartbeats, there was only the hiss of our oil lamps and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Connolly stepped forward and held his lamp near the opening, peering through the gap I had created. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "It's a proper chamber back there." We carefully widened the opening, knocking away chunks of coal until the hole was large enough for a man to squeeze through. When we sent Sparrow running to fetch Briggs, the boy's footsteps echoed back to us long after he had vanished into the darkness of the tunnel. Briggs arrived wearing a clean shirt and a silk scarf, attire wholly inappropriate for mine work. He examined the opening, sniffed the air flowing from within, and demanded to know the extent of the cavity. When none of us could answer, he rubbed his chin and ordered a full survey before the next shift. If the space was substantial, he mused, it could be timbered and used for equipment storage. If it extended deeper into the hillside, we might exploit it to access more of the coal seam. The Shoshone interpreter appeared that evening. I noticed him standing outside the cookhouse with 2 elders, all 3 watching the mine entrance with obvious concern. Briggs spoke with them briefly, a conversation that ended abruptly when Briggs made a sharp, dismissive gesture and turned away. The interpreter departed without accepting the customary offer of coffee, and I saw the elders shake their heads slowly as they left. That night, lying in my bunk, I felt a change in the atmosphere of the camp. The wind seemed colder, more insistent. Fine dust filtered through every crack in the walls. When I finally fell into an uneasy sleep, I dreamt of vast spaces beneath the earth, carved by hands that were not quite human. Dawn arrived gray and cold. Frost coated the railway tracks, making them gleam like silver ribbons in the weak light. We gathered our equipment in near silence, an unusual occurrence, as miners typically joke and complain in equal measure before descending into the earth. Even Connolly's usual humming was absent. At the mine entrance, our hands moved through the familiar ritual, checking lamp oil, testing wicks, ensuring our picks and shovels were secure. The timbers framing the entrance felt damp and rough beneath my fingertips. I remember thinking they looked older than they should, as though years had passed since we had installed them mere weeks ago. The temperature inside the mine followed its usual pattern, cold near the surface, gradually warming as we descended. My hands tightened around the handle of my pick, and I could hear Sparrow's controlled breathing behind me, each breath measured and deliberate. At the opening we had created, Briggs arrived with a coil of rope and a board for recording notes. He selected 3 of us, myself, Connolly, and Thomas Ward, to make the initial exploration whilst the others widened the entrance and secured support structures. We stripped down to our shirts to avoid snagging on the jagged edges, draped the rope across our shoulders, and squeezed through. Coals scraped against my back and shoulders, leaving black smears on my skin. The sensation of passing through that narrow gap was peculiarly unpleasant, as though I were being born into somewhere fundamentally wrong. On the opposite side, I found myself in a low chamber with a packed earth floor. The ceiling hung close enough that I had to hunch. My lamp illuminated stone walls that curved away into shadow. The air possessed that same dry, ancient quality I had detected earlier, but stronger now, with an underlying mineral scent that caught in the back of my throat. I called back through the opening to confirm we had arrived safely. Connolly and Thomas joined me within moments. We secured the rope to a protruding rock formation and began our survey. The chamber expanded into an oval shape, perhaps 30 feet across at its widest point. In the center stood something that stopped us all in our tracks, a pillar of pale stone, utterly unlike the surrounding coal. Its surface was smooth and hard, covered with shallow grooves cut in deliberate patterns. The markings were neither writing nor random weathering. They possessed an intentional geometry that suggested intelligence and purpose. Thomas ran his fingers across the grooves and announced quietly that this was not a natural formation. We all stepped backwards instinctively, though none of us could have explained why. I circled the pillar and discovered a narrow passage leading away at a downward angle. The walls bore the unmistakable marks of excavation, uneven surfaces showing where tools had struck repeatedly. However, the marks themselves were peculiar. The edges were not clean cuts, but rather a series of small chips, suggesting implements different from our own. The floor displayed shallow depressions arranged in a trail leading into the darkness. I crouched to examine these depressions more closely. They were not boot prints, nor hoof marks, nor any track left by familiar animals. Each impression had an elongated shape with two shorter protrusions that curved inward. The edges were sharp and clear, indicating recent origin. My hand trembled slightly as I traced one with my fingertip. Connolly called out. He had discovered something near the base of the pillar. A strip of pale material, flexible yet strong, lay partially buried in the dust. One surface was smooth and dry. The opposite surface bore small ridges in a regular pattern, like scales, though I was reluctant to voice that thought aloud. Connolly lifted it towards his lamp. The material caught the light with a dull luster that made my stomach tighten with instinctive revulsion. "It's some manner of skin," Connolly said slowly. "Something shed this." Thomas told him sharply to put it down. Connolly dropped it onto a rock and wiped his hands on his trousers with exaggerated thoroughness. The rest of our crew arrived through the widened entrance, their lamps multiplying the light and creating dancing shadows across the chamber walls. Briggs marched directly to the pillar, examined the carved patterns, then instructed Sparrow to sketch everything onto the recording board. The boy's hand shook slightly, but he produced careful, accurate drawings. Alvarez positioned himself near the narrow passage and stared into the darkness, his face drained of color. When Briggs inquired about the floor markings, I indicated them, and together we followed their trail to where they disappeared into the passage. Briggs ordered Eli Ward and Alvarez to fetch timber supports to brace the passage entrance. Whilst they departed, we secured the rope around the pillar as an anchor point and prepared to venture deeper. Briggs wanted 3 of us plus Sparrow to explore the passage whilst he and the others completed measurements of the chamber. I took the lead, followed by Connolly, Thomas, and Sparrow bringing up the rear with his recording board. We proceeded in single file through a passage that descended and curved to the right. The walls pressed close, forcing us to turn sideways in places. The floor continued to display those unsettling track impressions, and in several locations, I noticed drag marks between them, long, shallow grooves as though something had been pulled along the ground. Connolly whispered that the air felt warmer. I had noticed it as well, a gradual increase in temperature that seemed to emanate from somewhere below us. My lamp flame burned steadier, and a faint sheen of perspiration formed on my skin despite the general chill of the mine. We reached a fork in the passage. The left branch had a lower ceiling and carried a strong, sharp scent, intensely mineral with a hint of something organic and unpleasant. The right branch descended more steeply and carried a gentle current of air that brushed against my face. I paused, listening intently. From somewhere far below came a soft sound, a rhythmic tapping, like small stones striking each other in a deliberate pattern. Not loud, merely persistent. Sparrow heard it too. His sharp intake of breath confirmed as much. We chose the right branch, drawn by the moving air. I carved a notch in the wall at the fork to mark our route and continued downward. After approximately 20 yards, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first. The ceiling rose high enough that I could stand upright. Scattered across the floor were fragments of pale material, thin, curved pieces that crumbled when I picked one up, leaving a fine dust on my fingers. The smell here was stronger, similar to the left branch, but not quite as intense. Connolly's lamp revealed dark stains on the floor and walls. Old stains, long dried, but unmistakably present. Sparrow drew my attention to the far wall, where narrow vertical grooves ran from floor to shoulder height. These grooves were smooth and evenly spaced, as though something had repeatedly scraped or clawed at the stone. At the base of one groove, we found a small ring of stones with black residue in the center. I touched the residue cautiously. It smudged my fingertip with a sooty texture. The ring was far too small for a normal campfire. It appeared designed for heating small objects or perhaps providing minimal light in this enclosed space. Near the stone ring lay thin bones, hollow, brittle, from an animal I could not identify. They appeared to have been deliberately placed, not scattered randomly. We stood in silence for a long moment. The soft tapping sound rose through the floor again, closer than before, then ceased abruptly. The hairs on my forearms stood erect. Sparrow suggested in a whisper that we should return and inform Briggs. I readily agreed. We marked the chamber in Sparrow's notes, took one final survey of the space, and retraced our steps. At the fork, the smell from the left branch had intensified, and the air felt distinctly damper. I carved another notch and led us back towards the first chamber. Alvarez and Eli had installed the timber brace and were cutting wedges when we emerged. Briggs stood with Thomas, pacing around the pillar whilst counting his steps. He looked up as we entered and requested our report. We described the lower chamber, the stone ring, the wall grooves, and the old stains. When I mentioned the tapping sound, Briggs's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the slightest tightening around his eyes. "Intermittent?" he asked. "Yes, sir." It came and went. He nodded slowly and announced that we would need to push farther during our next exploration. His tone remained level, professional, but I detected an underlying tension that had not been present before. We spent the next 2 hours reinforcing the entrance, completing measurements, and documenting the carvings. Briggs instructed us firmly to avoid spreading rumors throughout the camp. Men abandoned their posts when confronted with things they could not understand. He explained. The company would arrange for a proper surveyor to investigate, and that would resolve all questions. He did not specify when this surveyor might arrive. As we prepared to depart, Alvarez bent down and retrieved the pale strip of material Connolly had discovered. He examined it closely, even holding it near his cheek briefly, then replaced it on the ground without a word. His silence felt more ominous than any comment he might have made. Outside, the wind had strengthened, driving fine grit across the ground in stinging clouds. We walked back to camp with our heads lowered and our lamps shielded. That evening, the Shoshone interpreter returned, accompanied by only one elder this time. They waited near the cookhouse until Briggs emerged. I positioned myself close enough to overhear their conversation. The elder spoke in a low, steady voice, and the interpreter translated. The ridge contains old chambers. They are better left undisturbed. Hunters avoid this area in winter because something moves when the earth sleeps. Briggs responded curtly that the company had work to complete. The elder raised his hand, palm outward, a gesture that clearly meant stop or warning, then departed with the interpreter, declining the customary offer of coffee and conversation. In the bunkhouse that night, Sparrow sat beside me, meticulously cleaning his lamp glass with a rag. He asked quietly whether I believed the elder's warning. I told him honestly that I did not yet know what to believe. Connolly pretended to focus on his own tasks, but was clearly listening to every word. Alvarez sat on his bunk, methodically sharpening a small knife with long, rhythmic strokes. The Ward brothers played cards in low voices, their attention seemingly elsewhere, yet I sensed they were equally alert to our conversation. I woke before dawn to a sound that did not belong. Not wind, not the familiar creaking of the walls. A dry, rhythmic ching emanated from the direction of the ridge, faint but steady, lasting for several breaths before ceasing abruptly. No one else stirred. I lay motionless, listening to the silence that followed. The stove ticked softly as the iron contracted in the cold. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me back to sleep, though my dreams were troubled and fragmentary. In the morning, Briggs assembled us with new instructions. Thomas would lead the next exploration, with Connolly and myself following. Sparrow would continue recording. Alvarez and Eli would transport timber supports. The remaining men would haul excavated material to the surface. I noticed that Briggs now carried a small pistol beneath his coat, a detail he had not previously revealed. When he caught me observing, he stated flatly that it was company property, as though that explained everything. We gathered our equipment and ascended the track. Inside the mine, the air felt warmer than it had the previous day. A fine dust hung, suspended in the lamplight, moving in subtle currents. At the fork, we turned right again, following our carve marks. The lower chamber appeared unchanged save for one detail that froze us all in place. The stone ring had been disturbed. Several stones now leaned outward at angles, and the black residue showed a fresh smear, darker at the edges where it had been recently touched or moved. Connolly swore under his breath. Sparrow's pencil hovered over his board for a long moment before continuing its sketching. We stood absolutely still, listening. The soft tapping sound rose through the floor, distinctly closer than before. It came in pairs, 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, with mechanical regularity. Alvarez took 1 step towards the far wall and stopped, his face ashen. He pointed at the floor near the vertical grooves. There, in the undisturbed dust, a new set of tracks crossed directly over our boot prints. The same elongated shape with curved ends. The edges were sharp and fresh. The dust showed a faint ripple where something had dragged between steps. Briggs knelt and examined the tracks without touching them. He remained there for a long moment, then stood and announced we would proceed a short distance farther before returning to report. He selected only Thomas and myself to accompany him. Connolly was instructed to keep Sparrow recording, whilst Alvarez positioned himself near the passage with his lamp set on a rock to provide additional light. We pulled the rope taut and advanced into the deeper sections of the mine. Our progress was slow and cautious. The passage narrowed, forcing us to turn sideways and edge forward. Our lamps trembled slightly because we were attempting to control our breathing. The air grew heavier, pressing against our chests. My boots encountered loose grit that shifted beneath my soles, producing a dry clicking sound. Briggs kept one hand on his coat where the pistol rested. Thomas held his lamp extended at arm's length, his entire arm rigid with tension. The walls transformed in character after we had descended perhaps 10 yards. The coal seam gave way to darker stone veined with gray mineral deposits that seemed to absorb lamplight rather than reflect it. Beyond that point, the tapping sound beneath our feet became constant, the same 2-tap pattern with pauses, unchanging in rhythm and direction. It suggested something engaged in patient, repetitive work. We reached another chamber, this one tall enough that our lamplight failed to illuminate the ceiling. The floor was dry and hard, worn smooth in places. Broken stone fragments littered the corners in piles, roughly waist-high. Some pieces were thin and curved. Others were shorter and more compact. None were coal. They were too pale, almost ivory in color. Something about that room crawled beneath my skin. Not the sensation of being watched precisely, but rather the distinct impression that we had entered a space actively in use, vacated only moments before our arrival. There were no carved pillars or symbols, only a single shallow trough carved into the floor, running from near the entrance to the opposite wall. The trough contained dried residue along its entire length. Thomas crouched to examine it more closely and went completely still. Briggs knelt beside him, leaning in with his lamp. Briggs touched the residue with his thumb, then lifted it to his face. His expression hardened instantly. The residue was red, not faded brown or dusty gray. Red. Out, Briggs hissed. Back. Now. We did not argue or request clarification. We reversed course immediately, moving as quickly as the narrow passage allowed whilst taking care not to disturb the rope. When we regained the lower chamber, the others remained exactly where we had left them. Sparrow clutched the recording board against his chest, eyes enormous. Alvarez had not moved from his position by the lamp. Connolly gripped his pick in both hands, clearly expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Briggs ordered everyone back to the first chamber. His voice remained steady and controlled, but his commands were clipped and absolute. We moved in single file up the passage. At the first chamber, Briggs gathered us round and issued instructions. We would seal the passage until a survey team arrived. We would discuss this with no one outside our crew until the company decided how to proceed. What we had witnessed in the lower room was no longer our concern. The Ward brothers nodded silently. Alvarez turned away, wiping cold dust from his eyes with his sleeve. Connolly stared at the floor until Briggs forced him to make eye contact and confirm he understood. When we emerged at the drift entrance, daylight felt wrong, too bright, too exposed. The cold air outside seemed thin and insufficient after the thick atmosphere below. The ridge behind us looked identical to any other Nevada hillside, yet it now carried a weight in my mind that refused to lift. We descended to camp in complete silence. Men working outside watched us with questions written plainly on their faces, but no one dared speak. Briggs went directly to his office and closed the door firmly behind him. That night, the bunkhouse felt oppressively tense. Men moved quietly, spoke in hushed tones. Sparrow lay on his bunk staring up at the rafters, unmoving for hours. Connolly sat on the edge of his bunk, rubbing his hands together repeatedly as though trying to remove something invisible from his skin. Alvarez prayed quietly in Spanish, the familiar words of the rosary barely audible. The Ward brothers smoked their cheap tobacco and said nothing whatsoever. I sat on my bunk, attempting to reconcile those track impressions with every animal print I had encountered in my life. Nothing matched. The shape was wrong. The spacing was wrong. The depth and character were unlike anything created by known fauna. 2 hours after the lamps were extinguished, I woke to that same dry, rhythmic tapping. Louder now, more insistent. The sound emanated from the direction of the ridge in steady patterns. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause. Exactly the same spacing as before. I rose and stepped outside. The other men stood scattered around the camp, drawn from their bunks by the sound. We gathered in small clusters, speaking in whispers or not at all. The tapping continued for several minutes with mechanical precision, then stopped with no gradual fade. At dawn, we assembled at the mine entrance, but Briggs halted us at the threshold. The company had decided to suspend all underground operations until the survey team arrived, he announced. Work crews would redirect their efforts to expanding surface structures and clearing excavated material. I observed anger flash across the faces of men who had not entered the hill. One declared loudly that we had discovered gold and were concealing it. Another suggested the Shoshone had cursed the ridge. Briggs told them bluntly to keep their mouths shut and perform the work they were being paid to do. The following 2 days passed slowly, weighted with unease. The tapping came every night, and occasionally in brief bursts during afternoon hours. The men who had never descended into the chambers grew increasingly irritable and suspicious. Sparrow lost weight with alarming rapidity. Alvarez refused to approach the ridge at all. Connolly began drinking whiskey early in the morning. The Ward brothers maintained their vigil behind the tool shed, watching the hillside in silence. On the third night, the tapping sound moved. Instead of emanating from deep beneath the ridge, the source seemed to advance towards camp. Still faint, but no longer distant. It carried through the cold air with a quality that suggested something patient and methodical, closing the distance between us. I stood outside when the shift occurred. The sky was clear, stars brilliant in the desert air. The sound grew incrementally louder, not dramatically, just sufficiently for every man present to understand we had crossed some invisible threshold. We formed a small group near the tool shed. Sparrow positioned himself between Connolly and me. Alvarez stood near the wall behind us. The Ward brothers moved to the front, hands resting on their belts. The tapping ceased. The silence that followed possessed physical weight, pressing against our ears and chests. Then the sound resumed, beneath our feet. A single dry scrape close to the tool shed door. A second scrape near the bunkhouse foundation. We all stepped backwards simultaneously. Briggs emerged from his office with the pistol drawn. He did not shout orders to calm down or return to our quarters. He simply asked where the sound had originated. Thomas pointed at the ground near the shed wall. Briggs raised the pistol, aiming at the dirt. He instructed everyone to move clear. The ground beneath the shed produced a single sharp click like stone striking bone. Silence. Briggs lowered the pistol slowly and ordered everyone inside. We would establish an armed watch until dawn, he announced. Nothing more. The men obeyed because there was no alternative thought available to grasp. I sat awake most of that night, my back pressed against the bunkhouse wall, my lamp burning low. My chest ached with each breath. Sparrow sat on his bunk, staring at the door without blinking. Every time I closed my eyes, the memory of that lower chamber returned. The trough, the red residue, the fresh tracks in the dust. We were not alone in that hill. This had become certainty rather than speculation. Briggs organized us into pairs for watch duty. I was partnered with Connolly for the first shift near the tool shed. The night air felt dry and sharp, each breath visible in the lamplight. Our lamp sat on a crate between us. Connolly rested his pick handle across his knees. He whispered that he had worked mines since childhood, and nothing had ever felt like this. Every mine possessed its own character, its particular smell, sound, atmosphere. But this was fundamentally different. He said it felt as though the hill operated according to its own order, and we had violated that order simply by entering. I did not respond. My voice felt unreliable. We maintained our watch for 2 hours, hearing nothing. No wind, no tapping, no scraping, just profound stillness that made every breath seem thunderous. When the Ward brothers relieved us, I returned to the bunkhouse and attempted sleep, without success. The stove had burned low, and cold settled heavily throughout the structure. Sparrow had not slept at all. He sat with his back against the log wall, knees drawn up to his chest. At dawn, the cook rang the breakfast bell, but only half the men responded. Some had not slept and lay exhausted in their bunks. Others were too frightened to step outside. Briggs ordered the men who had never entered the ridge chambers to continue moving excavated material. He instructed our small group to remain near camp and rest until the survey crew arrived from Ely. He did not know when they would arrive. Ely was several days distant by rail. We spent that day clustered near the bunkhouse. No one wanted to approach the mine entrance. The men moving tailings cursed under their breath and kept glancing towards the ridge. The atmosphere in camp felt like a drawn bowstring, vibrating with tension and ready to snap. Near noon, the Shoshone elder and interpreter returned. They stood well away from the camp boundaries until Briggs walked out to meet them. I observed the exchange from a distance. The elder spoke, the interpreter translated, and Briggs shook his head repeatedly. The elder placed a small pouch wrapped in hide on the ground and gestured towards it, an offering, perhaps, or a protective charm. Briggs kicked the pouch aside and turned away abruptly. That night, the tapping returned in irregular patterns. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, long silence for taps. Each strike felt purposeful and deliberate, as though conveying information in a language we could not comprehend. We gathered outside the bunkhouse again. Briggs stood amongst us with the pistol visible in his hand. He ordered us inside. We moved quickly this time. No one argued. Shortly after midnight, a scream shattered the silence. It came from outside, near the processing structure. I ran to the door with Connolly and Sparrow close behind. When we emerged into the cold, we saw Eli Ward running towards camp, his arms flailing wildly, his eyes enormous with terror. His voice broke in his throat as he tried to speak. His words were incoherent fragments. He kept pointing back towards a ridge, his entire body shaking. Thomas ran to his brother, grabbed his shoulders, attempted to calm him, but Eli began clawing at his own shirt, then at his throat, as though something inside prevented speech or breath. He collapsed directly in front of us and went still. I knelt beside him. His chest did not rise. His eyes remained open, staring upward at nothing. Thomas stared down at his brother's body, his own body trembling with a slow, rigid motion. He did not cry. He did not shout. He simply placed his hand on Eli's chest, left it there momentarily, then looked at Briggs without any expression whatsoever. Briggs instructed us to move the body to the tool shed until morning. We carried Eli to a workbench near the back of the shed. Thomas stood outside the door and refused to leave. None of us attempted to force him away. When dawn arrived, Briggs wanted to bury Eli immediately. Thomas refused. He insisted we wait for the survey crew so they could witness everything. Briggs argued that the Nevada sun would decompose a corpse rapidly, but Thomas would not relinquish his brother's body. Briggs eventually conceded. By noon, new marks appeared in the ground near the mine entrance. Not tracks on the surface this time. Deep, narrow gouges in the dirt, as though something sharp had been dragged towards the entrance. The marks were thin and even. They led directly to the mine opening and vanished beneath the timber framework. Briggs ordered us to maintain our distance. He instructed the men who had never entered the chambers to gather their belongings and depart on foot towards the nearest railway camp, 20 miles distant. The company would disapprove if they discovered this decision, but Briggs no longer appeared to care about company policy. He told those men they would forfeit their final week's wages, but no one argued. They packed quickly and departed at a near run, never looking back. Our group remained. Myself, Connolly, Alvarez, Sparrow, Thomas Ward, Briggs. 6 men. We spent that day inside the bunkhouse with the windows blocked by planks. The tapping began again at dusk, louder than any previous night. The floorboards vibrated subtly with each strike. Sparrow flinched at every sound. Briggs sat at the table with a pistol beside him, his eyes fixed on the door. Near midnight, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence felt more dangerous than the sound. In the quiet, a new noise emerged, a faint scraping on wood outside the bunkhouse door. Then a second scrape, deliberate and slow. Connolly whispered urgently for us not to move. Briggs raised the pistol, aiming at the center of the door panel. Sparrow gripped my forearm with such force that his fingernails dug into my skin, leaving crescents that would bruise by morning. Something pressed lightly against the door. The wood flexed inward, not enough to break, but sufficient to demonstrate force. The pressure held for several seconds, then released. The scraping moved towards the window. The glass made a soft sound, like a fingernail sliding across its surface, testing, exploring. Thomas whispered his brother's name. Not from hope, but from instinct, from the desperate need to assign humanity to whatever stood outside. He gripped the knife he had sharpened earlier, knuckles white around the handle. The scraping ceased. Complete silence descended once more. Then the two-tap rhythm began again, but this time it emanated from directly beneath our feet, from the cellar space below the floorboards. Briggs fired a single shot straight down through the boards. The sound that rose in response was a low, rattling exhalation that resembled no human throat, no animal I had ever encountered. It sounded like air forced through cartilage and stone, through something simultaneously organic and mineral like the T-dawn. The tapping ended. The cellar went silent. No scraping, no pressure on the wood, nothing. When we finally ventured outside, The ground around the bunkhouse displayed fresh impressions in the dirt. The same shape we had seen in the chambers, narrow at one end, wider at the other, with shallow ridges along each side. They formed a complete ring around our shelter, spaced with disturbing precision. I understood then that we were being observed, measured, studied. We remained close together that morning. No one wanted to stand alone, even for a few steps. Briggs announced we would not return inside the hill under any circumstances. We would wait for the survey crew and depart the moment they arrived. The authorities could determine how to proceed, not the mining company, not us. He attempted to sound authoritative, but his voice was hoarse with exhaustion. His shirt hung untucked, and his right hand trembled when he tried to holster the pistol. Thomas stood by the tool shed with the door open, staring at his brother's body. The corpse had stiffened during the night. In the harsh daylight, the shape on the table looked unreal, like a poorly made effigy rather than a man who had been alive less than 24 hours earlier. Sparrow consumed nothing. He sat near the bunkhouse steps with his back pressed against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest. He still clutched the recording board he had used in the chambers, though he never looked at it. Alvarez walked the perimeter of camp in a slow circuit, muttering prayers and glancing at the ridge every few seconds. His lips moved continuously, reciting familiar liturgy that seemed to provide him some measure of comfort. Connolly sat on an overturned crate, methodically polishing the metal end of his pick. He had ceased humming entirely. The silence from him felt more ominous than any words. Briggs ordered me to burn the rope we had used inside the chambers. He stated that anything which had touched those spaces should be destroyed. I took the coil outside the camp boundaries, piled dry brush around it, and set it alight. The rope shrank and blackened rapidly. The smell was acrid and unpleasant, clinging to my clothing and hair. When I returned, Alvarez asked quietly if I felt anything different. I told him no, though that was not entirely honest. I felt a peculiar pressure inside my skull. Not pain exactly, but a sensation that existed beneath discomfort. Something that sat in the space between thought and physical sensation. 2 hours later, whilst the sun stood at its zenith, a long, sharp crack echoed from the direction of the ridge. It sounded like a massive slab of stone snapping under tremendous strain. Then came a continuous grinding of earth and rock, a deep rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. We all turned towards the mine entrance. The timber framework around the opening shifted visibly. Dust rose from the cracks and drifted into the air in gray plumes. The ground beneath our boots shook once with a short, violent jolt, then went still. Connolly swore viciously. Sparrow closed his eyes and lowered his head. Briggs stood motionless for several heartbeats, then summoned us to the center of camp. If the hill was becoming unstable, he explained it could collapse and engulf us. We would relocate our equipment to the far side of camp and wait there. He did not mention creatures or anything unseen. He refused to speak those words aloud, perhaps because articulating them would make them irreversibly real. We moved everything we could carry. We selected a location near the creek where the ground was open and flat, where sunlight reached without obstruction. It felt marginally safer than the shadows near the ridge. Thomas refused to move his brother's body. He insisted Eli would not be abandoned alone. Briggs told him to bring the corpse. Thomas refused again, so the body remained in the tool shed. By late afternoon, the wind intensified. Fine dust rose from the ridge and blew towards camp in thin curtains. It carried that familiar scent I had detected in the narrow chamber beyond the fork. Sharp, mineral, oppressive. As the sun descended towards the horizon, we heard the tapping once more. This time, it did not originate from the ridge. It came from beneath the tool shed, the same slow rhythm as before. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause. Exactly the same spacing as that first night when everything began. Thomas drew his knife and walked towards the shed. I moved to follow, but Briggs grabbed my coat sleeve and held me back. Thomas never stopped. He walked directly through the doorway. We heard his footsteps on the wooden floor. A moment later, A single sharp impact of wood against wood echoed from within. Then silence. Briggs raised the pistol and ran towards the shed with Alvarez close behind. Connolly followed. I reached the doorway as Briggs yanked it open. Thomas stood inside with both hands clenched around the edge of the workbench. His shoulders rose and fell with shallow breaths. His head bowed slightly. His brother's body lay exactly where we had placed it that morning. Nothing had changed from the moment we left the corpse there. Briggs called Thomas's name. No response. Briggs stepped closer and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. When Thomas looked up, I saw something in his eyes that did not belong in a man standing in daylight. His pupils were dilated enormously. His jaw held tense in a way I had never witnessed before. He whispered that something had moved beneath the floorboards. He said he had felt it press against the boards under his feet. The way he spoke was not frantic or panicked. It was flat, emotionless, as though he had accepted something fundamental and irrevocable. We backed out of the shed. We attempted to persuade Thomas to leave. He would not. He said he would not abandon Eli. He sat down near the door of the shed with a knife in his right hand and his brother's body behind him on the table. Night descended with no color in the sky, just a rapid fade from gray to black. We lit 3 oil lamps and positioned them in a triangle around our new camp location near the creek. No one slept. Sparrow sat between Connolly and me with his arms wrapped tightly around himself. Alvarez remained standing, refusing to sit down. Briggs paced in tight circles, his boots scraping the dirt with mechanical repetition. Around midnight, the tapping started again beneath the shed. Then it moved beneath the ground between the shed and the creek. Not rapidly, not loudly, just closer. Then we heard a second set of taps, farther back near the mine entrance. Then a third set from farther right near the tailings pile. 3 separate patterns moving simultaneously. 3 distinct sources. Every muscle in my body tensed at once. Sparrow's breathing turned rapid and shallow. Connolly lowered his pick because his hands shook too violently to hold it steady. The tapping stopped. The silence lasted long enough to kindle hope for perhaps 1 second. Then came a new sound, a solid drag across soil near the creek. Slow, prolonged, very close. Briggs lifted the pistol towards the sound. His hand trembled visibly. He stepped backwards until he stood beside us. The lamps flickered in a breeze that had not been present moments before. Then we saw movement at the edge of the light. It crouched low with elongated limbs pressed close to the ground. Its skin was pale, greenish-gray and appeared dry, almost scaled. Its head was narrow and stretched, with flat, dark eyes positioned far apart on the skull. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of small, pointed teeth. It produced no sound. It merely breathed in short, shallow bursts that we could hear clearly in the stillness. Behind it, another shape rose into visibility. Then another. We stood frozen. The lamps illuminated their movements in brief fragments. A shift of shadow, a glint of light on scaled skin, the angular motion of a limb. The nearest creature tilted its head in a sharp, mechanical motion. It stepped forward into the outer ring of lamplight. Its skin displayed a pattern of overlapping ridges down the sides of its torso, like scales or plates that shifted with each movement. Its hands were disproportionately long, ending in curved black claws that looked hard and sharp. It straightened to its full height, standing upright now, taller than a man by at least 6 inches. Its chest expanded and contracted in slow, deliberate rhythm. Briggs fired directly at its face. The creature did not fall. It turned towards him with no visible reaction whatsoever. And then it moved. The speed was impossible to track. One moment, it stood at the edge of lamplight. The next moment, it had crossed the distance without any perceptible motion in between. It struck Briggs's arm. The pistol spun through the air and landed in the dirt 10 feet distant. Briggs cried out and dropped to one knee. The creature's claws had left 3 clean vertical cuts through Briggs's coat sleeve. Blood ran down his forearm rapidly, soaking the fabric and dripping onto the ground. The creature did not press its advantage. It stepped backwards and observed us. Alvarez shouted that we needed to retreat towards a creek. Connolly grabbed Sparrow by the collar and pulled him bodily. I kept my eyes fixed on the nearest creature. Its dark eyes tracked every movement we made with focused precision. Two more shapes moved into view behind it. All three formed a slow arc, blocking the path back towards the ridge. They were not attempting to drive us back into the mine. They were pushing us farther from the hill's base, as though we had violated territorial boundaries, and this was their method of enforcement. Thomas shouted from the shed that there were more beneath the floor. I could not see him through the open doorway, but his voice sounded altered, not panicked, but possessed of a dull certainty that was somehow worse than fear. Briggs forced himself upright, clutching his wounded arm. We backed towards the creek slowly, maintaining our lamps between us and them. They responded by matching our pace exactly, advancing at the same rate we retreated. When our boots struck the loose pebbles at the creek's edge, the creatures halted. Their bodies went completely still. Only their heads moved, tracking our positions. The nearest creature raised its shoulders slightly, a small, deliberate motion, and released a short, dry hiss. The sound resembled air forced through narrow cartilage, organic yet mechanical. Another hiss answered from the left. Then silence. Briggs whispered urgently to check the creek for a crossing point. The water was only knee-deep, but wide enough to present danger in darkness. Alvarez stated we had no alternative. Sparrow said he could not swim well. Connolly assured him he would provide assistance if necessary. The creatures stepped backwards as a group, not turning, maintaining their orientation towards us, and moved towards the shed where Thomas remained. They stopped near the door. Alvarez started towards him, but Briggs grabbed his shirt and pulled him back forcefully. Briggs said Thomas had made his choice, and we could not reach him without being cut down before we got close. Alvarez shouted that we could not abandon him. Briggs stared at the shed for a long moment, then said quietly that if Thomas was staying, he was already lost. That statement made Sparrow release a sound like crying without tears, just air moving out in small, broken bursts. In the lamplight, I could see Alvarez's jaw trembling. Thomas did not react to our shouts. He sat inside that shed with his brother's corpse and those things outside the door. I did not know if he was waiting to die or if some part of him no longer desired to leave. The creatures maintained their positions around the shed in a precise ring. They were not rushing forward. They were waiting that we crossed the creek with agonizing slowness. Connolly lifted Sparrow onto his back and held his lamp high. The water was shockingly cold, numbing my legs within seconds. The stones underfoot were treacherously slick. My lamp dipped perilously close to the surface, but I steadied it before the flame extinguished. On the opposite bank, we formed a tight cluster and moved deeper into the scrubland. My lamp revealed low brush and uneven ground studded with rocks. We climbed a small rise and looked back across the creek. The creatures stood at the water's edge. They did not cross. They maintained their positions, observing us with that same focused stillness. Their posture never altered. They never broke formation. The shed door shook once from an impact inside, then a second time. After the second impact, the lamplight reflecting off the water showed two creatures push the door inward with slow, controlled force. They entered the shed. Thomas never made a sound. We turned away and abandoned that camp permanently. We walked towards the railway spur with only lamplight to guide our way. The scrubland and loose grit made progress painfully slow. Briggs's wound bled through the cloth he had tied around it, but he did not request we stop. Every few minutes he glanced back towards the ridge, but he never suggested returning for Thomas. Alvarez muttered prayers continuously under his breath. Sparrow clung to Connolly's shirt until his fingers went numb and white. After approximately 2 hours of stumbling through rough country, our lamps began to fail. The light thinned progressively, and the flames flickered with increasing frequency. We discovered a small wash with elevated ground and packed earth. We decided to rest there until daylight returned. Connolly planted his pick in the dirt and sat with his back against it. Alvarez sat facing the direction from which we had come. Sparrow curled up on the ground and fell into an exhausted sleep despite his terror. Briggs attempted to rest, but flinched each time pain pulsed through his wounded arm. My thoughts refused to quiet. I could not dismiss the image of those creatures standing in our lamplight. Their stillness, their patience, their deliberate restraint. They could have torn us apart at any moment. They possessed the speed and weapons to do so. Yet they refrained. They never moved with frenzy or chaos. They moved like organisms that had evolved in subterranean environments with precise efficiency, with physiological confidence, with no fear response tied to violence or aggression. Just before dawn, Sparrow jolted awake from a nightmare. He said he had seen a long corridor of smooth, dark stone and a trough filled with fresh blood. He said there were hands dragging something across the floor in slow repetition. He did not describe the hands in detail. He covered his face and said he did not wish to remember more. When daylight finally broke, the world appeared flat and colorless. The ridge behind us looked identical to any other western hillside. No indication whatsoever of what dwelt beneath its surface. We continued walking towards the railway spur. The sun climbed higher. Grit accumulated in the corners of my eyes, making them burn and water. We reached the spur by afternoon. The small railway structure stood there with a hand pump and a short siding track. The water tasted distinctly metallic, but was safe enough to drink. Briggs collapsed on the wooden platform and leaned against the wall. He asked Connolly to examine his arm. Connolly cut the sleeve away carefully and inspected the wounds. The cuts were clean and deep, with edges too smooth to have been caused by rock or metal. They looked surgical, almost deliberately precise. We waited there until dusk. No survey crew arrived. No one traveled down the rails in either direction. When the sky dimmed, Briggs announced we would walk the rails through the night to reach the next camp. He said when we reached the nearest settlement, we would report everything exactly as it had occurred. The government authorities could decide how to proceed, not the mining company, not us. We set off again as darkness fell. Walking the rails felt considerably easier than crossing rough terrain. Sparrow walked on the wooden ties because he said it helped maintain his balance. Alvarez continued glancing behind us every few miles, as though expecting pursuit. Connolly held his pick like a soldier carrying a rifle. I walked beside Briggs to prevent him stumbling from blood loss and exhaustion. 2 hours after darkness descended, we heard a single tap far behind us on the rails. Then silence. No second tap. No rhythm. Just one loud, resonant strike traveling along the steel track. Sparrow froze in place, his entire body going rigid. Briggs told us to keep walking. We did. We pushed through dry wind and profound darkness until we glimpsed lights on the horizon just before dawn. A telegraph office stood at the edge of the next settlement. A collection of perhaps 20 structures clustered around a main street. Briggs entered the office, and I followed him inside. He emerged 30 minutes later, his face gray with exhaustion and pain. He said messages had been transmitted to the nearest law enforcement office and territorial officials. He said riders would be dispatched to retrieve the bodies at Blackwater Ridge Camp. He said men would be sent to seal the mine permanently. We remained in that settlement for 3 days. During that time, none of us achieved proper sleep. Sparrow vomited twice daily from sheer nervous exhaustion. Alvarez refused to enter any building with a cellar or basement. Connolly could not remain indoors for longer than an hour without experiencing acute anxiety. Briggs lay in bed, feverish and increasingly pale. His wound developed a foul smell. Not the familiar odor of infection, but something else, something mineral and organic simultaneously. A doctor was summoned. He examined the wound and stated that the tissue appeared poisoned in a manner he could not identify. The edges of the cuts had begun to turn grayish black, and the discoloration was spreading slowly up Briggs's forearm. On the fourth morning, Briggs went still. He died before noon. His eyes remained open, staring at nothing. The doctor insisted on sealing his body in a coffin immediately and burying him before sundown. We did not argue or request delay. That night, a lawman from another district arrived, a stern gentleman with gray hair and suspicious eyes. He questioned each of us separately, recording our statements in a leather-bound notebook. We told him every detail precisely as it had occurred. He wrote everything down, but did not appear convinced. His expression suggested he believed we were either lying or had experienced some form of collective delusion. 3 days later, a telegraph operator informed us that a message had arrived from the recovery team that had ridden out to the old ridge. They had found the camp. They had found the bunkhouses, the processing structure, the tool shed. They had not found a single body. Not Eli, not Thomas, not Briggs, not any evidence of struggle or violence. Every building was empty and clean inside. Tool racks remained undisturbed, equipment in place. The mine entrance had collapsed under its own weight. The hill was sealed. The ground around the shed showed no depressions, no drag marks, no tracks of any kind. The operator asked if we had fabricated the entire story. None of us answered him. I departed Nevada that same afternoon and never returned. Sparrow disappeared a year later in Idaho. No one discovered what happened to him. Some said he walked in the mountains alone and was never seen again. Others suggested he had taken his own life, unable to bear the weight of what he had witnessed. Connolly died of pneumonia in 1909, though I heard rumors he had been drinking heavily for years and his health had deteriorated accordingly. In his final days, he reportedly spoke of pale creatures in the darkness and refused to sleep without a lamp burning beside his bed. Alvarez lived until 1938. When I encountered him by chance in 1924, he was an old man, bent and gray. I attempted to discuss that winter in Nevada, and he turned away from me without speaking. His eyes held a warning so profound that I never raised the subject again. I still dream about the lower chamber, the narrow depressions in the dust, the smell of ancient mineral air, the long, smooth trough carved with obvious purpose, the red residue that was too fresh, too vivid. I know what we saw. I know what walked in those hills, what had carved those passages over countless years, what had lived beneath the earth long before men arrived with picks and ambitions. I know they permitted us to leave. That knowledge haunts me more than anything else. We were not driven away by mindless beasts. We were not attacked by animals defending territory. We were removed with precision and patience by something intelligent, something organized, something that understood restraint and calculation. The creatures could have killed us all within moments of emerging from the earth. Instead, they herded us away from their domain, enforced their boundaries, and allowed us to depart once we had crossed those boundaries. They took Thomas and Eli for entering their spaces, for violating their territory, for touching what should not have been touched. But they let the rest of us go. I am now 73 years old. My hands shake when I write, and my memory fails me in small ways each day. But I remember every detail of that winter with absolute clarity. The sound of those dry taps beneath our feet, the hiss of air through cartilage, the dark eyes watching us with focused intelligence. In the decades since, I have read every account I could find of unusual discoveries in mines and caves. I have sought out other miners who might have encountered similar things. I have found fragments, stories dismissed as folklore, reports classified as hallucinations, accounts buried in obscure journals. There are patterns, reports of carved passages found deep underground, descriptions of tracks that match no known animal, accounts of crews that disappeared without explanation after breaking into concealed chambers. The stories are dismissed, always. Rational minds require rational explanations. Strange mineral deposits, toxic gases causing hallucinations, accidents covered up by embarrassed mining companies, folklore and superstition. But I know the truth. Beneath certain hills and mountains, in passages carved over millennia, something else dwells. Something that preceded us. Something that tolerates our presence above ground, but defends its subterranean territory with absolute determination. Something that remembers. I have never returned to Nevada. I have never sought out Blackwater Ridge or whatever name that location carries now. I suspect the site is unmarked, forgotten, grown over with desert scrub. Perhaps that is best. Some doors, once opened, can never be properly closed. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. Some boundaries, once crossed, mark us forever. I write this account not seeking belief or validation. I write it as a warning for those who dig deep into the earth, who break through into hollow spaces, who discover passages that were not made by human hands. Leave them sealed. Do not enter. Do not disturb what dwells beneath. They were there first. They have been there far longer than we have walked upon the surface. And they will be there long after we are gone. This is my testimony. I swear it is true. May God have mercy on those who fail to heed this warning. Written by my hand on this 15th day of March, 1932.